Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to today's Partner Web Conference. This is Fast Track Dynamics 365 for Finance and Supply Chain Management Tech Talk. Today's topic, Warehouse App Task Validation Framework. My name is Janice and I'm going to be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this web conference through Teams live events and the audio can be heard through your PC speakers. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. Participation in the meeting today does indicate your consent to being included in the meeting recording. Attendees may access the web conference recording via a link that will be delivered by email within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, you can use the Q&A panel located on the right-hand side of your screen. We do have presenters standing by to respond to your questions throughout the session. Now, on to the presentation. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Principal R&D Solution Architect, Zach Greenvoss, and supporting us on Q&A is Senior R&D Solution Architect, Marc Deygere. So without any further delay, Zach, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Hello, and thanks for joining this Tech Talk. We're going to be covering a new framework added to Dynamics 365 for supply chain management called the Warehouse App Task Validation Framework. So this is a pretty exciting new feature that enables the warehousing mobile flows to be tested by the Regression Suite Automation Testing Tool, which was not supported previously. So the Dynamics 365 products have moved to the concept of one version, which means all customers are on the same product version and Microsoft provides continuous updates in a predictable time frame. We're not going to be discussing one version in much detail here, and I'm going to assume everyone watching this Tech Talk understands why we moved to this model and how much it has helped the customer base, especially around taking platform and application fixes. One version update cadence means we release a monthly service update almost every month and a larger feature release twice in the spring and fall. There are ways to pause these updates for a few months if necessary, but in general, we expect most customers to stay current with our quality releases. We publish the expected preview and general availability dates so that customers and partners will be able to plan for the upcoming changes. Now, some of the feedback we have heard from the community is that there are concerns about the amount of changes added through these one version updates. The answer to this is the Regression Suite Automation Tool, or RSAT. This is a tool that allows business processes to be recorded and converted into automated validation tests, which can then be executed quickly upon taking one of the monthly or bi-yearly updates. So we have a number of Tech Talks and workshops that have been conducted around RSAT. I'm going to assume, for the sake of this Tech Talk, that all of this material is already understood. If you have not explored this tool, then I highly recommend the series of Tech Talks we offered on setting up and running RSAT in detail. The key item here is that RSAT makes use of the Task Recorder tool, which is a native part of Dynamics 365 for supply chain management. This task recorder allows functional users to record their business processes and use them for validation scenarios through the RSAT tool. The advanced warehousing solution in Dynamics 365 for supply chain management makes heavy use of the mobile app, which is a Xamarin application built for Android and Windows 10 devices. This allows workers to be mobile in the warehouse and execute the various movement, picking, and receiving operations required for the core distribution operations in a modern warehouse. And the bad news is that because the RSAT tool utilizes the core technology of the task recorder that is built into Dynamics 365 for supply chain management, it currently does not support the mobile warehouse app. Until now, this meant that warehouse workflows, at least any that utilize the mobile app, were unable to be validated and tested with RSAT. So that brings us to the point of this new framework. The Warehouse App Task Validation Framework is the bridge that allows you to create regression tests utilizing RSAT with the mobile workflows using the mobile application. We will cover the details throughout this talk, but at a high level, we have basically added a new user interface to Dynamics that can be controlled with RSAT and which can drive the mobile workflows. To really understand what we're doing with this framework, it's important to peer behind the curtain a bit and see exactly how the mobile application is operating. The mobile app itself does not have a lot of client-side logic built into the system. It's largely a shell that makes heavy use of the server-side processing in Dynamics 365. The mobile app sends XML to a custom service endpoint, at which point the WHS work execute display class hierarchy takes over and executes the state machine logic. Note that all of this takes place in X++ on the server. This is a key point to remember. So when you want to validate that the processing of a warehouse picking operation was successful, for example, you would want to validate that these WHS work execute display classes have executed the given work and returned the correct status. The actual user interface manipulation within the mobile app is not necessarily required for the core validation. As I said, the mobile app takes the input from the user and submits it as an XML package to the Dynamics 365 custom service and receives the results from the server processing as an XML document. This is key because the general premise of the new framework is that if we record and submit the same XML, then we should get the same results from the warehouse workflows. So here's an example of XML sent from the mobile app to the custom endpoint on the server. You can see the XML is broken down into the different controls with attributes that are filled in with the data entered by the user. In the element I have highlighted, you can see the name of the control is the WHS work license plate ID, and you can see this data attribute. It contains the data entered by the user. In this case, it's the work ID, so WUSMF-00243. Then here's an example of the result XML sent back to the mobile device. This contains the list of controls to display to the user with any data that's already populated by previous steps or the server-side processing. So these two XML documents, the input and output documents, are what the new warehouse app task validation framework is built around. We will provide an easy way to push data into the input XML, and we will build validation around this output XML. So the new warehouse app task validation framework basically adds two components to the system. The first is an XML recorder, which can monitor and store the input and output XML documents from the custom endpoint, which remember is what the mobile device is communicating with. This means it can sort of act like the classic task recorder in that it can store the activities conducted in the mobile app for playback later. The other major component is the UI that allows users to define the recordings and manage the details like variable replacements. As I mentioned earlier, this UI is consumable by the classic task recorder and thus can be driven by RSAT for true end-to-end testing operations. So this slide comes from my colleagues who gave the RSAT TechTalk. It walks you through the different major components involved in creating regression tests. So the starting point is the LCS library and the Business Process Modeler, or BPM. This is where you have stored and defined your business processes. These business processes are then recorded in Dynamics 365 with the task recorder by functional users and pushed or saved into the BPM. Once in LCS and the BPM, these recordings are synced over to Azure DevOps and become test cases. This is important because when you run the actual RSAT test client, it reads the test case definitions from Azure DevOps and executes them against Dynamics. Thus, success or failure is based on the validation logic in the test itself. Again, this is just a quick review of the components involved in the overall RSAT topology. The RSAT TechTalk will have more detail on each of these steps. The app task validation framework plugs into this overall collection of tools. As we have seen, it allows the warehouse mobile app to interact with Dynamics, and the app task validation framework itself acts as the bridge between the core task recorder and the rest of the existing tools you've already seen in play. Okay, so let's take a look at this in action, what I'm going to show you is, so this is RSAT, the Regression Suite Automation Tool. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kick off these two tests that I have highlighted, and then it's going to it'll go through those two tests in an automated fashion. What these two tests are doing is, the first one is creating a sales order, and I would say this is a very standard RSAT test, so it doesn't do anything with the warehouse mobile app. So it creates a sales order, adds a line, reserves that line, and then releases that to the warehouse, right? So it does the release process. And so you could have done all of that up until now with RSAT. The second test then takes that sales order and executes the picking work in the warehouse using the new app task validation framework. And that's the one that's going to be using this new UI that we're going to be covering and sending these XML documents to this custom endpoint that's the same as the mobile app does. So this is all being automated by RSAT. Right now we're creating the sales order. We've added the line. We're now reserving the inventory. I know it goes kind of fast. And then what's going to happen very quick here is it's going to get released to the warehouse. And then we will take a look at the work actually. So that we can grab the work ID. The reason we go to this page is so we can grab this work ID. Because clearly we need that if we're going to go execute the work. Okay, so that's the end of that first test, right? Which again was just kind of a standard RSAT test, creating a sales order. The second one now is going to go to this new UI, this app task validation framework UI. It's going to find the correct picking operation that we recorded earlier, that I recorded earlier, put in that work ID, and then execute those steps that we would do typically in the mobile app. Okay, so here's the new UI. It's going to filter to the specific pick. What's happening right now is it replaced that work ID, and now it's sending the XML to the custom endpoint. And then now it's going to walk through and validate that each of those steps was successful. Obviously, that happens pretty quick. We'll dig in and take a look at that in a little bit here. But at the end, what we've now just done, which you couldn't do until this framework was in place, is we have done kind of a complete end-to-end of, we've taken a document from Dynamics 365, like a sales order, we've released it into the warehouse, and then we validated that a specific mobile flow could be executed and validated, tested and validated using this one tool, this RSAT tool. Okay, so that's kind of where we are going. I want to kind of show the complete picture of how that is useful. Okay, and like I said, we'll dig into this more. Okay, so now you saw the full operation in action. Let's take a more detailed look at the actual UI elements for the warehouse app task validation framework. This is the new UI that was added to manage and control these mobile recordings. And as you saw in that second RSAT recording, it is also what is used by RSAT to drive the warehouse workflows. The UI itself is comprised of 4 fast tabs, with each tab containing a grid of data that's generally related to some data element higher up the chain. So if it helps to visualize the data relationships here, this is the high-level logical data model for these elements. Again, we'll walk through each of these elements in the UI in detail, but this can help see the multi-tiered structure with the top-level element tying it all together. So at the top level, you have the task itself, and hanging off this is a collection of 0 to n task input data, which is basically like the variable data which can change for each test. Also hanging off the task itself is a set of recorded steps. These are the specific steps that a user has done in the warehouse mobile device while the recording component is enabled. Finally, attached to each recorded step is an optional set of validation rules. As you'll see, it's possible to create a set of validation rules at each of the steps in the mobile app. So at the top level, we have the task itself, which represents the warehouse business process we want to record and play back through an RSAT validation process. All we need at this point is a description and the specific worker ID that will be executing the workflow. This is the user ID entered into the mobile app itself, and the same user account will be used when playing back the recording in the future. The buttons at the top are fairly self-explanatory, with the Start Recording button the way to engage that XML recording component we discussed earlier. This will clear all of the previously recorded steps for this task and reset the warehouse user session data and begin the recording of all XML in and out of the custom service endpoint for that specific user ID. This is important to remember, since the session is terminated when a recording is first started. It means users will be redirected to the login screen and then to the initial default menu, thus guaranteeing a known starting point for all recordings. The Run Task button will launch the playback screen and build the XML documents with the required replacement data if necessary. This is the screen that actually pushes the XML into the warehouse framework and replicates the mobile device playback. The View Task History allows you to view the results of any previous runs. You can see the results of your validation failures, if any, and to diagnose if things have regressed or work on debugging your recordings while you are building them. We're going to jump down to the Recorded Steps tab, which is exclusively populated via the recording feature we discussed above. When a task is being recorded, each of the operations performed by the end user is captured. We store the XML sent from the mobile device to the AOS as the input XML, and the XML returned from the AOS to the mobile device as the output XML. Each of the steps are given a default name based on the mobile device menu item, although it is encouraged to customize this to make it more meaningful when running the steps later. The XML previously recorded at each step can be viewed and edited here as well. Each of the recorded steps can be assigned a validation policy. This configures how we determine if the playback was successful or not. Obviously, the RSAT tool has validation built into the overall process, and it would be possible to validate that the high-level business processes were successful, such as the sales order was successfully picked. But the Warehouse App Task Validation Framework also allows for fine-grained, step-by-step validation of the mobile workflows to ensure at critical steps in the process you are getting the expected results. There are currently 3 policies we are shipping with this framework. No validation means that this step will not be validated, and we will assume some other downstream process will ensure it was successful. Full XML validation means that the output XML that was captured at recording time must exactly match the output XML at playback time. This can be useful for some very specific workflows or areas where it is difficult to perform control level validation. However, it is not the recommended approach. If any changes occur in the menu item structure or the overall XML definition of the custom service, it would mean all of these validation steps would need to be re-recorded. The data value validation is really what we recommend for all real validation scenarios. This allows you to define a set of rules against the data controls. We'll see more on this throughout the talk. So another grid on the main page is filled with task input data, or more commonly known as variable data. This allows you to define controls that will be populated with dynamic data at runtime. The drop-down list will display all controls that were used during the recorded process. This is obviously necessary for whatever top-level business document you are using to drive the workflow, such as the PO or SO number. Each time you run the workflow, this variable will need to be updated to the new value. So as you saw earlier in the sales order creation and sales order pick RSAT tests, we used these variables to push the work ID of the new sales order into the mobile flow using this mechanism. Each time the framework encounters the defined control, in this example, the item ID, it will use the provided value here instead of whatever was recorded previously in the XML. And ultimately, since these are part of the UI in Dynamics 365, it means that RSAT can update them through its standard process, including using the Excel sheet to manage the variable data across tests. So there are a few special cases to discuss with variables. In most cases, you can probably utilize the control-based variables and be fine. But in some workflows, you will find that you need more control of the data. This can happen because the warehouse app reuses control names, and so a single replacement value won't suffice. In these cases, it is possible to type a value into the variable name field, in which case this variable can now be utilized in the XML through the @ symbol syntax. Now, this unfortunately does mean you will have to manually edit the input XML documents to make use of this feature. So as you can see, I've done here. I've added the target license plate ID var variable and will be passing the value to the license plate ID field. So another advanced feature to note is that the variables have a type, which is reflected in that second column. Now this is typically going to be user set, meaning that the variable takes the data input by the user here and uses it in the XML recording at playback time. However, the other variable type is server set, and it can be defined at a control level when you want to capture the results of a server-side operation and make use of the specific data elements later. When a variable is defined in this manner, the value returned by the server at playback time is captured and sent back to the server with each subsequent workflow step, as opposed to whatever value was previously recorded. So a perfect example of this is when a license plate is generated by the server during a receiving process. So this value is obviously generated by the server, so we won't have a user set variable that holds this value. And furthermore, this value will be unique each time the warehouse process is executed. So we need to define it in such a way that the value is grabbed from the server and retained over each of the recorded steps. And we do have a button on the UI called Generate Variables. This will execute an algorithm to try to identify all the areas in the XML that have changing data and pull them out as variables. This also tries to identify the user and server set variables based on when the first time we see the data, either from the user or the server processing. An important thing to note is that this process does modify the recorded XML directly. It will pull out the data and replace it with a newly defined variable with the @variable syntax in the XML. I would also say this is still a work in progress, and I have found some areas where it does not identify all the data to be replaced. But it can be a good starting point if you have a complex process and you want to pull all the data out into variables. Just be sure to test this extensively first. So we talked before about the different validation policies you can assign to each recorded step. If you assign the data value validation strategy, then the fourth FAST tab in the UI is unlocked, and you can define a set of validation rules for the specific selected step. These validation rules are all based on controls and data returned from the server. In other words, in the output XML document. This is because this is the result of the AOS processing. So ultimately, it is what you are trying to ensure is still working after a one version update or bug fix or feature change, for example. So when you build the validation rules, you can select from a list of controls that were found in the output XML document. You can also type in controls. For example, if you want to ensure a certain error control is not present. You can build rules around the existence or lack of existence of these controls, as well as the value of the data returned in them. So we currently offer 5 validation rules. You can see the list here. We can test for the existence or non-existence of a control, and we can test if the control contains a specific string or if it's greater than or less than a numeric value. Now for these last 3, the value to compare can be entered directly into the data value column, or it can be taken from a variable using the @variable name syntax we saw earlier. You can see here I'm comparing the item ID to an item variable, but I'm comparing the location ID to a specific string, FL-001 in this case. Both of these are valid. So once you've defined the top level business process, you're able to start the recording process by clicking that Start Recording button. This will clear any previously recorded steps and validation rules, as well as reset the user session. So while in recording mode, every interaction performed in the mobile app for that specific user account will be recorded. This means the input XML, again, the XML sent to the server, and the output XML, the XML returned to the mobile device from the server, will be saved into a new recorded step object. We try to give it a meaningful description based on the menu item executed, but I do recommend updating these names to be more meaningful when you are examining the playback steps. The validation strategy also defaults to none. As I mentioned earlier, it's probably a good idea to change this to a data value validation. Clicking the Run Task button will launch a new page that enables playback of the test. This action also performs the variable replacement if possible, and you are able to view the XML that will be sent to the server on this page. On the playback page, you can run the actual test, which, as we discussed, will push the defined XML to the same endpoint the mobile device communicates with. This is important to remember. From the perspective of the server-side code, it cannot tell the difference between the mobile app interacting with the system and these XML documents being sent from the warehouse app task validation framework. So this is why we believe it is valid to build a solid validation framework around this. It is mimicking the interaction a user would experience with the warehouse mobile app. As I mentioned, you can view the input XML on this screen, and once the task has been executed, you can view the output XML returned from the server. You will also see any validation failures, and you can see the error messages listed in the third column, which can then be monitored by the RSAT tool to ensure the task is successful or not. Okay. So let's take a look. So once you have an environment that has this framework in place, and we'll talk about how that can happen in a minute here, but you will find this new framework under the warehouse management. It's under periodic tasks, and then there's this new menu item called warehouse app task validation. So that's going to be where you find this UI that we've been talking through. So here's the new UI. You can see these 4 fast tabs at the top level. We have the high level business processes. So if we took a look at, for example, that this is the picking operation that we executed through RSAT earlier. So you can see we have the task input data on this second fast tab. So this is where the work ID and the target license plate, both of which are required for this business process. These can be set. And then here is where we have the different recorded steps. So these are each of the steps that are executed. And at each of these steps, we can have a set of validation rules if we've defined data value validation. Okay. But let's take a look. What we're going to do right now is we're going to record a new business process. I think I'm going to go ahead and remove this one so that we can use that same name. Okay, so we're going to do a fairly simple sort of inventory lookup, and we're going to record that using this framework. Right, and we're going to define the user as 24, which is going to be the warehouse worker ID. Okay, so I'm going to define the name, user ID, and I'm going to click this start recording. Right, this will give me a warning, and it will put the system into kind of the recording mode. So it engages that recording component that we took a look at earlier. Okay, so now I'm going to log into the system, again, using that user. And so now, remember, everything that I'm doing now, each interaction is being recorded by this validation framework. So if we go to the inventory menu, we go to the item inquiry menu, and then we're going to put in some data, and we'll get some results back. So we've just done a kind of a simple inventory check using the mobile app. Okay. So if we come back to Dynamics, we stop this recording. What we can do is we can come back here and we can see the steps that were recorded. Right. So like I said, we try to give kind of a meaningful name, but it's always kind of good to just update these and make sure that they make sense to you. Like what I might do, like as you saw in that sales order one, I might put in here that this is where we put the item ID as that last step. But we can walk through and see you can click this view XML, and you can see the XML that was sent, that was recorded, that was sent to the server, and the XML that came back from the server to the mobile device. And this is that XML with the different controls and the data elements in those controls. Hopefully you don't have to kind of dig into this XML too much. Hopefully you can do most of it through this UI. So these steps, so this was going from the login to the main menu, and then the main menu to the inventory screen. And so if we built validation here, if we wanted to build a validation, one of the things that we can build is to make sure that, especially when you're navigating through menus, a good validation rule is to make sure that whatever that next menu item that you're going to click is available, right? Because if it's not, then something has gone really wrong with the process. So we know that we're on the main menu now, and these are all the controls or all the menu items that are displayed in that main menu. And we know that we're going to click that inventory menu item next. So what I might do is build a validation rule on this step that just says, I better see that inventory menu item in that output XML, that better exist, or we're going to be in trouble for the future steps. And I might do that for each of these kind of navigation steps. All right, so on this one, I know that the next thing that I'm going to click, I'm on the inventory menu now, and I know the next one I'm going to click is the item inquiry, right? Because that's what we did. We went into that item inquiry. Okay? And then now I'm in the item inquiry. I've gone from there, and you can see this is where we went from the, so this is the inventory, and on the input XML, we know that we're in the inventory menu, and then we clicked on that item inquiry menu item, and the output XML now is the actual UI that said, enter an item ID. So we're on the actual kind of page where it says, let's put in that data there. So the validation I might put here for this step might be that we need to make sure that that item ID is visible in that output XML, right? So we got to that work process, and we can see the expected control that we want to see. All right, and so for this last one, this one will be more interesting, right? So this is where, from the user's perspective, they entered an item ID, right? So the label here says enter an item ID, and if you looked at this item ID control here, you can see that the data entered is that A0001, right? So that's when I actually put in the data to the mobile device. Okay. And what we can look at now is we can see on the output XML how that result was passed back to the mobile device for display. And so what they do when they sort of display those cards to the user, it basically iterates through. And so you'll see this control name, WMS location ID 0, and then the quantity label 0, and then it'll repeat, right? So WMS location ID 1, and then quantity 1. So what we might build as a simple validation, just for now, we might ensure that we can at least see this WMS location ID 0, and that has, based on the demo data that we know, we might validate that it always will show this location bay door as that first location. So the validation rule I might put in here will be that WMS location ID 0, right? So that control that we saw, again, remember this lists all the controls that we see in that output XML. So this WMS location ID 0, that exists, and the WMS location ID 0 contains the value location bay door, right? So now we've recorded the steps, we walked through in the mobile device and sort of did the mobile workflow operations that we would expect. We've come in here, looked at those steps, built some validation rules around it. The other thing we could do here is build some variable data, right? So if there was some data that we wanted to change each time we ran this test, remember that's what we did for the sales order one. Any kind of major business documents, you're going to need something that drives that. So in our case, all we did is enter in the item ID. It was really the only changeable data, but we could kind of pull that out here and say, okay, the item ID is going to be set here as A0001. Obviously, if I change that, it might change, if I change that right now, it might change the results that we get down here. So I'm not going to change it to a different value, but this will at least now use this item ID and use whatever value that I've placed in here. Okay, so now we've kind of built all the components necessary that we need to run a test. So if we wanted to right now, we could do this run task for this inventory lookup. And as we saw earlier, this goes to this kind of playback screen where it lists all of the steps. And this is one of the reasons I recommend updating these steps so that the names are kind of meaningful, so that, you know, if something fails, you can kind of know, oh, well, it failed at this step. That might tell me something. So at each of these steps right now, you can view the XML. Now, obviously, we haven't sent this to the server, right? So this is kind of like ready to go. So all these XML documents are built. So if there's any variable replacement that needed to happen, this would actually happen here. So this can kind of be a way, if you're debugging and things are not working right, this can be a way to see maybe there's something wrong with your variables. But you do have the input XML that's available right now. You don't have this output XML because we haven't executed this workflow yet. This specific sort of instance of the workflow we haven't actually done. So that's going to happen when we click this run test. Right, so if we do this run test, it's going to essentially start at this top one, send that XML, get the results back, send this next XML. It's going to walk through each of these steps, again, executing it from the server's perspective as if we just did those same 4 operations that I did here, right? And then the success or failure is going to be based on those validation rules that we defined. Okay? So now if we click on any of these and we said view XML, so this input XML hasn't changed. This is still the ones we sent to the server, but what we now have is the output XML, the results of that processing from the server, right? And so all the way down to, you know, the final one, we can see that we got, you know, the expected results from the server for that inventory operation. Okay. So again, what I kind of want to show you as well is a more complex one, that sales order pick that you saw earlier, right? So this one obviously has these 2 high-level variables, one of which is the work ID, right? So this work ID needs to be changed every single time, because if we are executing the same work, then we would expect to see a failure, right? We would expect it to not be able to execute that work. And so this work ID came from actually that sales order that we created as part of the RSAT test that you saw in the first demo. And then you can see all these different validation, all these different steps with the validations that I've added. Again, the first couple are basically sort of navigational steps. And then after that, you have the actual operations in the sales order picking menu item, right? So the first thing that we do is enter the work ID, and then we enter the license plate, and then we enter the target license plate, and then we do the put step, right? So I want to call this out here. One of the things that I've done is obviously we're validating that we are seeing kind of the expected location. After we enter the work ID, it should really be directing us, again, based on sort of the demo data that I've configured, it should really be directing me to go pick from FL001, right? So that's what I've put there. But what I'm also putting is I've entered manually this error control, right? So this error control is not in the list of controls. It was not seen in this output XML if we took a look at that. So I typed in this control name, and I wanted to make sure that it does not exist, right? And so there's a reason for that, and that is whenever the mobile device displays a menu, displays a message to the user, then it comes in a control that is called error. That's just always the name of what that is. And so if we got an error at some point in one of these steps, right? If we got an error showing up, that would indicate that something's gone wrong in this process, right? That maybe the work ID isn't valid, or that license plate isn't valid, or something has failed on the server. And so that's why for each of these steps, I actually validate that we're not seeing an error control show up until we get to this final one, in which case I actually do expect to see this error control. And that is because if you take a look at this output XML from the end, and again, this is the end of the picking process, you can see we have this label, right? So this control type label, and the name is error, right? So this is kind of a standard error that pops in whenever the mobile device wants to show you a message. And that label that then gets displayed, or the message that gets displayed to the user at the end of this picking process is work completed, right? As you would expect if you're familiar with the picking process in advanced warehousing. And so what I do is at the very end of this process, at the put operation, I do validate that we are seeing that and the value should be work completed, right? So that I have some confidence that we've gotten all the way through that picking operation successfully. Okay, so what I actually want to show you right now is a failure condition. So again, remember what I told you is that this work ID was updated with the work ID from that previously created sales order that we released and that we picked, right? So this is now essentially a stale work ID. So if I ran this task right now, it will fail at one of these steps because of one of these validation rules, right? So I kind of want to show you that process of it failing. So we're going to run this task. And again, remember, this has now done all of the variable replacement. So if we took a look at that XML inside here, this is using that work ID. Remember, this is that WHS work license plate ID, which is the work ID. And this is that work ID that is defined in the variables right now. And so it already replaced that, sort of getting it ready to send it to the mobile device. Sorry, the mobile endpoint. So if we run this again, this is going to fail because that work ID is essentially a stale work ID. So you can see that it did the first couple of steps correctly. It essentially did the navigational steps correctly. And then when it got to this step where we put in the work ID, it did fail. And these are the kind of error messages that are coming out of those different validation rules that we put in there. Right, so the first one, it says, oh, it did find that field error, and it didn't find kind of the picking operation, right? It didn't tell us to go to this location ID and pick. And we can actually click on this and see, oh, well, what happened? Why did this fail? And we can look and see, what would the mobile device have displayed at that point? And we can see that this is actually giving us that error, and it's saying, no valid work line, because again, this was already closed work, like this work had already been executed. And then it's just sort of, again, with the mobile device, it's kind of putting you back into the top of the work or the state machine. It's saying, okay, now scan a work ID, which is why we also didn't find any of the location IDs that we would expect. Okay, and so this is what, at the very end of that sales order picking process that we were seeing from RSAT, what I was doing was the RSAT was coming in here and validating that all of these check marks were successful. And if it wasn't, then RSAT would have thrown up an error saying, oh, we failed the process, right? Something has gone wrong. And then if you are validating this column, these error messages could then be bubbled up all the way into RSAT and ultimately into your Azure DevOps test cases, so you can see what went wrong, right? And then you could come back here and view this task history, and you could see the history of all the different processing, right? So you could see for this one, it failed here. The previous one that we ran at the top of the hour, this one was successful, right? So these are all the different times that this has run. Okay. Okay. So now you've seen the new UI and how to create recordings, including validation rules at the individual step level. But how does this all tie in with RSAT? So as I said previously, since we've now exposed a way to drive warehouse mobile flows through the standard D365 UI, it is possible to leverage the task recorder to replicate the steps a user might perform. And as soon as we have the task recorder enabled, we can now unlock the rest of the tool chain. So LCS, BPM, Azure DevOps, and then finally RSAT. So the first step is to create a task recording that drives the warehouse app task validation page, including filtering to the specific task and updating specific variables. This will automatically cause the corresponding RSAT recording to contain the necessary input fields in the Excel file, which can be used to drive the replacement data. Once the variables, if any, have been updated, you will run the task while still recording and perform any task recorder validation on that playback page as necessary. Once you have completed the recording, you'll save it to your LCS business process library. This will then sync over to Azure DevOps and ultimately be available in the RSAT client tool. From here, you can use the tool to create the executable files and populate the Excel parameter file with necessary variable data. So there's a lot more detail here I'm glossing over. As I mentioned, this Tech Talk is assuming you are familiar with the core principles of the RSAT tool, which includes support for global variables and chaining together of tests. These are both useful when you are handling warehouse tests as well. It is also possible to define random values in the Excel parameter file, which can be useful when you need a unique value like a target license plate ID. And all of this is defined in that Excel file. So again, I just wanted to bring back to this and to show how all these tools interact. And we're going to walk through this here real quick, but we're going to show going from using a task recorder, pushing it into the BPM, syncing it over to Azure DevOps, and then pulling it into RSAT, right? And then we'll utilize that app task validation framework. Okay. So I'm in Lifecycle Services, and I'm in my BPM, or Business Process Modeler. What I want to do is I want to add a new process. So I'm going to add a new process here called like inventory lookup. Okay, so now we have a business process that we've defined in the BPM, right? And so what we can do now, just make sure that my session is updated. So again, kind of good task recording, like necessary task recording behaviors always start from the main dashboard of Dynamics. So we can start a task recording. Inventory lookup demo in the warehouse. Okay, so now we're using the task recorder, right? So this is now using the standard task recorder. This is not using what we were recording earlier, which was in the mobile device, just to be clear. So in the task recorder, we'll now go to the warehouse app task validation. Right, and so we want to make sure that we are now validating this this business process, right? The inventory lookup that we created earlier. So in RSAT, the way to do that, you can't just click on that grid because when this test runs, there could be, a variable number of tests that this executes in the future. So the correct way to do this would be to filter this data to the specific test that you want to execute, right? So we'll filter this to the test that we created earlier, which is inventory lookup. And now we know that this one is selected. We could also come in here, and if we needed to do any replacement data, we could come in here. Sorry. And we could filter this to item ID, for example, and then come in and do any updating of this value, right? We could change it if we needed to. For example, in that sales order test, we obviously did have to change this to the correct work ID. Right. So, but once we've done that, then we can, we know that this one is selected, then we can click this run task, which again, we'll go to that page here, which is sort of getting it ready to execute. And then again, while I'm still recording in the task recorder, we click this run test, which actually then goes and executes using that app task validation framework, executes these XML steps against the custom service endpoint we've been talking about, right? So again, from the server's perspective, we just executed a mobile warehouse flow. And then again, using the task recorder, I can now validate that these steps were correct. So one of the ways we can do that is we can add validation steps to our task recording. So we can say that we want to make sure that for each of these steps, this success checkbox or the Boolean flag is currently true, right, for each of these rules, each of these steps. Right? And this is what you also saw when we did that sales order picking. You watched at the very end when it walked through all of these. It was like 7 or 8 of them, and it validated that each of them was successful. Okay, so now I'm going to stop the task recording, and I'm going to save it over to Lifecycle Services. right? So again, what we're going to expect to see is this list of business processes that we've saved in the BPM, and we're going to associate it to that specific inventory lookup demo, right? That business process that we just created over here in the BPM, okay? Because those are the steps that we now expect to execute to validate that business process. Okay, so we feel pretty good about this. Saved it to LCS. Come back over here. We can refresh our library. And for this inventory lookup demo, we can now see that there is a diagram associated with it. So there's now a business process that's been recorded in the task recorder. And if we take a look over at this requirements, because I've set up syncing over to Azure DevOps, we can see that this is now syncing a work item as well as a test case, right? So this now has a test case over in BPM. Okay, so now if I jump over into Azure DevOps, right? So that kind of that box on the bottom of those of all the different tools, we are now in Azure DevOps, and in Azure DevOps, I've defined a test suite called WHS, and this is the same test suite that when I open up RSAT, it is pulling the tests that are defined in here, right? So there's a one-to-one match between these two things. Okay? So now what I really want to do is add that test that we just added. So we can add an existing test case. We can essentially find it, and we have this inventory lookup demo. This is the one we just created. So if I add this test case into this test suite, now if I essentially click load in RSAT, what we should see is this now has this WHS test suite or test plan now has 5, and you can see this inventory lookup demo has been added here. This is the one we just created. Okay, so now if I click this new, this creates all the necessary executable files and parameter files that will make this test able to run against my environment. Right? So it's kind of the basically like the final step that you need to do to make this actually an executable test. Okay, so now, unless I've missed a step along the way or I did something wrong in that recording, if I clicked run, this would go back in and re-execute that task recording that we just created, which would include going to that app task validation page and executing the mobile flow that we defined. Right? And also, if we click this edit, it would show us the parameter file with any of the parameters that we entered in, right? So when we went into that variable section and we put in this data, this is where that gets captured as part of the RSAT Excel sort of variable replacement, right? So this is where this could be set. So a really interesting one to look at actually is this sales order, right? So the one we saw earlier, because if we looked at that parameter file, we would see that when we're updating the variables there, we actually update that target license plate to a random value. It's important that that's unique for each run. And we update the work ID to a global variable, right? So this is how RSAT defines global variables. And this variable was copied from the previous test when we actually created and released the sales order. So that's where that kind of strange value comes from. Okay, so if we run this now, again, unless I've missed some step along the way, what we should see is this now go into the Dynamics instance that I have. It should go to that warehouse app task validation page, filter to the specific test that we recorded earlier, and then sort of validate that that has been executed successfully. Okay, so you can see all the 4 steps are now walk through, make sure that those are valid, and then it comes back into RSAT and says that, you know, this will show up as passed, and it'll push that value back up to Azure DevOps as well. Okay, so yeah, there you have the passed, right? So we've kind of now, I hope is clear, we've kind of shown all of these different components interact. Right, so all of these different components you saw me creating the business process in the BPM. You saw me recording with the task recorder and utilizing that app task validation, which is mimicking the warehouse the warehousing app that we used earlier, syncing that or saving that over to BPM, syncing that over to Azure DevOps, and then executing it all via RSAT. Okay, just a few more things here, and then we can wrap up. So one question that is commonly asked is how to move tests between environments. Perhaps you have a developer environment where most of these have been defined, but you want to move the finished versions to a shared testing or validation environment. So we have shipped 4 data entities with this framework, each one corresponding to those four major data elements in the UI: the task object, the variable data, the recorded steps, and the validation rules. All of these can be exported, including the XML, and imported into another environment using these 4 data entities. And they all start with WHS Warehouse App Task Validator if you're looking for them. Okay, so now that I have everyone excited to try this new framework and add warehouse validation results to your RSAT testing strategy, what version will you need in order to use it? So we added this feature natively in 10.0.6. So any version of that will contain this framework. Now, unfortunately, we just missed the cutover for 10.0.5. And so you'll need to apply a quality update to this version in order to get the framework added. So it's available now. If you check the listings of KBs for a 10.0.5 environment, and you find the one listed here, so this KB that I've put here, that means that it does not yet have that framework installed, and you would need to take that quality update and apply it to a 10.0.5 environment. Also note that the framework is included in a model that is excluded from being deployed to production. So it is not available in production, just to be clear. So it's only available in UAT, like T1 through 5 add-ons, and Dev 1-box environments. It was deemed too risky to include this level of direct manipulation on a production environment. So we've been using this framework with several customers in kind of early release or early preview versions. So some of the issues that we have seen, or some of the things that I want you to be careful of as you use this. Again, we talked about that generate variables. I would just again caution, use that with caution. Make sure you validate the XML that gets generated or gets replaced, because there sometimes are some misses there. An error that you will likely see as you work through recording and trying to play back is this unexpected difference between request and session data, right? And it means that the XML is out of sync, right? So that what you are sending to the server is not what it is expecting to see. It usually means that not enough validation has been added to your steps and something has gone wrong earlier, but you didn't catch it, right? So in the example that I showed where that sales, or we tried to do the picking operation with essentially the stale work ID, if I hadn't had that validation in place and we just said all no validation, for example, for all the steps, and we would assume, oh, I'll validate it later using something else. After we hit that step that said, hey, wait, this isn't a valid work ID, remember that next step would still send that XML. And that when that XML hit the mobile endpoint, it wouldn't know what to do with it. And so you'd get this error. It's a bit opaque, but the error is coming from kind of lower down from the mobile flows, like from the actual warehouse mobile app flows. So it usually means there's something out of sync. I've also seen this when somebody, and myself, mistyped a variable, for example, when putting it into the XML, in which case it just gets sent directly as a @ string as opposed to getting replaced. And you can, like I said, you can see that in the XML that gets generated. So if you, like I said, you'll probably see this error. If you really can't figure out what is the difference and why this is happening, you can use this. I've called out kind of the place where this validation happens, this user session request validator. And again, if you're really stuck, you can get a developer to put a breakpoint here, and then that it's pretty clear to see when you compare the two XML documents what is expecting and what is coming. You can pretty quickly see the problem there. So again, that's kind of a handy place to keep in the back of your mind. The other thing that I've seen just recently is it is possible through a little bit of error conditions to kind of accidentally have multiple recordings active. So if you remember, when you get a recording active, it puts up a modal dialog and tries to have essentially keep it so that only one recording is currently active in the UI. But it is, it is possible that maybe that browser session fails or somebody else comes in and starts another recording, and especially if it's for that same worker ID, then the recording feature is going to be really confused and actually pick up both sessions. And so I've seen some errors there. So just be aware that this is kind of considered basically like a development time task, and you need to be careful that really only one recording is active at a time. Okay. So that is the end of my prepared topics. So I'll call out to Marc, who's been monitoring the questions, see if there's anything we want to kind of bubble up and discuss.
Yeah, the first question that I'm having open is it possible to change the user ID after recording a task?
No, it's not.
I know that I was hesitating as well. It is in the XML file, but probably it has side effects.
Yeah, I think that you could. I think technically you could. You would be manipulating that XML document though. So I think probably it's generally safe to say no. You would need to re-record with that new user ID.
Okay, and then we had Ian, who was asking a lot about well, how about the new process guide framework? Mm-hmm. Is that supported here as well?
Yep, absolutely. So that the process guide framework is entirely on the server, right? So that really just defines how the WHS work execute display classes execute on the server. From the perspective of the mobile device, it's still just sending XML and receiving XML, which is really where this, this is interacting with the system. So it doesn't matter if it's a process guide, activated workflow, or kind of a standard old style workflow, whatever you want to call that, classic workflow. So that doesn't matter at all. At the end of the day, it's still the XML documents are still coming in and out.
And he had a side question, if we have an idea of when all the processes will be migrated to the new framework.
That is a good question. I believe we are targeting for the spring release of 2020, but obviously that's dependent on a lot of factors. So.
Yeah, and then Florian was asking if we have looked into just making the form WH work execute available for task recording instead.
Yeah, so I mean we have, and we decided that. I mean, the way that interacts with the backend system, the way that it kind of what it calls is not the same that the warehouse app actually executes. And so there are some things that you cannot do in that work execute form, and there are some things that are different. And so we really wanted the same process that would work in that app. We wanted the same processes to work there in this validation framework, because really the way forward and the way we always recommend is to test using the mobile app itself, not using that kind of emulator form.
And Andre is asking what would happen if the XML file is changing because you have additional fields or so?
So the XML file can change, and that's part of why the data value validation is looking at specific controls. So it is possible for it to change, yes.
Yes, and with the XML validation, then we would get an error. If you do the data validation and the button or control that you are looking at is still there, it would just continue and ignore the other information that was added to the XML.
That's right.
Or removed even.
Yep.
Okay, that was it, Zach. I don't have any open questions otherwise.
Great. All right, well, thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you, Zach. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a brief moment here and bring your attention to a link that I posted in the Q&A panel. That's a link to a short survey for this web conference, and we ask that you please take a moment before logging out to access it. We hope that you found today's information helpful, and if you enjoyed today's web conference, have feedback on how we can provide you with a better event, or you'd like to submit topics for future web conferences, this is your chance to let us know. We do appreciate the time you take to do this, and thank you for your support. And that is going to conclude today's web conference. The recording and a copy of the presentation deck will be available within 5 business days. Please look for an email from Worldwide Learning in the coming days that will include details on how to access those. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters, Marc and Zach, and thank you, audience, for logging in and joining us today.